A widowed millionaire arrives at an elite school to pick up his 9-year-old son and witnesses a scene that leaves him speechless. His shy boy, often the target of bullying, is surrounded by bullies when an 8-year-old orphan girl steps in bravely and yells, "Leave him alone now, he's my friend." Little did he know that, hidden, he was watching everything, and the decision he makes next is shocking. The fine, persistent Thursday rain wrapped the luxury sedan in a grey veil, blurring the outside world into a wash of somber colours. In the back seat, Arthur Sterling was ending a call that sealed the acquisition of a tech firm on another continent. His voice was calm, precise, and devoid of emotion, a sharp instrument he wielded to build his empire. The driver, a discreet man named Evans, kept his eyes on the road, accustomed to the relentless pace of his boss's life. For Arthur, time was a currency more valuable than gold, and every wasted second was an irreparable loss. He hung up and sighed, the weight of the silence falling on him like a heavy blanket. This was the part of the day he dreaded most, the transition from ruthless tycoon to hesitant father. He looked at the gilded gates of Ethelred Academy, a fortress of privilege and excellence that consumed an obscene slice of his annual fortune. He paid for security, for a top-tier education, for an environment that was supposed to shield his son from everything, perhaps, except his own absence. His son, Leo, was 9 years old and had his mother's eyes, large, brown eyes that seemed to absorb all the world's sadness. Since Helen had passed away 2 years ago, Arthur had tried to fill the void with expensive toys, extravagant trips, and the best education money could buy. But he knew, in a dark corner of his soul, that he was failing. He saw it in the way Leo hunched his shoulders, how his laugh was rare and fragile, how he preferred the company of books to other children. Arthur rubbed his temples, the familiar throb of a headache starting. He was doing his best, he told himself. He was building a future for Leo, a legacy. But the uncomfortable truth was that he hid in his work because he didn't know how to navigate the minefield of single fatherhood. Especially with such a sensitive boy, Helen would have known what to do. She always knew. As the first students began to file out, dressed in their impeccable uniforms, Arthur felt the knot in his stomach tighten. He scanned the crowd for Leo's light brown hair, and then he saw him. His heart didn't just tighten, it froze. Leo was cornered near an old bronze statue, his small body trembling. 3 older boys surrounded him, their faces twisted into cruel smiles. One of them shoved Leo's shoulder, making him stumble backward. Their words were inaudible through the car's thick glass, but the taunting was universal. He saw Leo's face crumple, tears streaming silently down his cheeks. Other students walked past, some casting curious glances, most indifferent, hurrying to find their own parents and drivers. No one stopped. No one intervened. A primal fire, a paternal fury he hadn't felt in a long time, rose in his throat. His hand was on the door handle, his body tense, ready to storm out and tear those boys apart, with cutting words and veiled threats of power. But before he could move, a tiny, improbable figure emerged from nowhere. It was a girl, perhaps a year or 2 younger than Leo, in filthy, torn clothes and worn-out sneakers that barely protected her feet from the damp sidewalk. Arthur vaguely recognized her. She sometimes lingered near the gate, and he had occasionally given her a few dollars or asked Evans to hand her a snack. She planted herself between Leo and the bullies, her thin arms spread wide as if she could create an impassable barrier. Her voice, surprisingly loud and firm, cut through the damp air. "Leave him alone," she yelled, with a fierce determination that made even Arthur shrink back in his seat. "He's my friend." The bullies, taken aback by the audacity of a street kid, hesitated. Her courage, born from having nothing to lose, was a force they didn't understand. After a moment's pause, they scattered, muttering insults. Arthur watched, paralyzed, as the girl turned to Leo and, with unexpected gentleness, wiped his tears with the grimy sleeve of her jacket. In an instant, she had offered his son a protection that all his fortresses of money and power could not. And there, watching his son being shielded by the most unprotected child in the city, Arthur was hit by a devastating truth. He knew absolutely nothing about being a father. The silence inside the car was thicker than the fog clinging to the windows. Leo got in and sat down, his body curled into the vast leather seat, his eyes fixed on his small hands resting in his lap. The girl, the unlikely savior, vanished into the drizzle as quickly as she had appeared, a fleeting apparition of courage in a world of indifference. Arthur wanted to say something, anything. He wanted to ask, to comfort, to promise it would never happen again. But the words were heavy and foreign in his mouth, tools he didn't know how to handle in the delicate terrain of a 9-year-old's feelings. He just signaled for Evans to drive, and the car slid smoothly away from the gilded gates, leaving behind the scene that had been seared into his mind. "Are you okay, son?" he finally managed to ask, his voice sounding more formal than he intended. Leo shrugged, a tiny gesture that screamed volumes. "I'm fine," he mumbled, not looking at his father. Arthur felt the distance between them like a chasm. He could cross oceans to close a deal, but he couldn't cross the few inches that separated them in the back of his own car. At home, the mansion seemed even larger and emptier. The housekeeper, a kind woman named Mrs. Gable, came to greet them with a warm smile. But Leo slipped past her like a small ghost, heading up the stairs to the refuge of his room. Arthur stood in the foyer, the cold marble beneath his expensive shoes echoing the chill in his chest. He dismissed Mrs. Gable for the rest of the day, a sudden need to handle this alone, though he had no idea how to begin. Later, he knocked hesitantly on Leo's door, holding a tray with his favorite snack. He found the boy sitting at his desk, drawing. "I thought you might be hungry," Arthur said, setting the tray aside. Leo didn't answer, focused on the paper. Arthur looked over his shoulder. It was a drawing of 2 stick figures, one large and one small, holding hands. The large figure had a smile. The small one did not. Arthur's heart broke a little more. He knew who the figures were. The absence of a smile on his son's face was a silent, devastating indictment. In the days that followed, Arthur became an observer. He rearranged his schedule, cancelled non-essential meetings, and started picking Leo up from school every day. He watched from a distance, his heart in his throat, waiting to see the bullies again. But they kept their distance. Instead, he noticed something new. Leo no longer walked out of school with his head down. There was a lightness in his step, a spark of something that resembled anticipation. Arthur realized his son always glanced toward the same alley across the street before getting into the car. Once, he saw a flash of colored fabric disappear into the alley's shadow, the exact moment Leo smiled in that direction. It was her, the girl. Their friendship was a secret, a silent pact that blossomed on the fringes of Leo's privileged world. The realization brought a mix of relief and a pang of jealousy. Leo had a friend, someone who made him smile, and that someone wasn't him. The change in Leo's behavior was undeniable. He started talking a little more during dinner, sharing small details about his classes. The perpetual cloud of sadness that had enveloped him seemed to be dissipating, layer by layer. Arthur's gratitude for the mysterious girl grew each day, but along with it, guilt gnawed at him. If her presence could cause such a transformation, how long had his son been suffering in silence? One night, the need to understand became unbearable. After Leo fell asleep, Arthur entered his room, moving as quietly as a thief. He felt like an intruder, violating his own son's privacy, but ignorance was an even greater torture. He opened Leo's school backpack, his heart pounding. Tucked between textbooks and notebooks, he found a sketch pad. He flipped through it carefully until a crumpled, torn page caught his eye. It was hidden at the very back. It was an old drawing, the paper yellowed and soft. It depicted a small figure, unmistakably Leo, surrounded by three larger, menacing figures. Tears streamed down the boy's face in the drawing. In the bottom corner, almost erased, was a date from 6 months ago. The air left Arthur's lungs. This wasn't a new incident. It was a recurring nightmare his son had been living alone, and he, the protective father, had had no idea. The discovery of the old drawing was like a punch to the gut. 6 months. For 6 months, Leo had endured this torment in silence, finding refuge only in his art. In lines that screamed what his voice could not, the guilt transformed into a ravenous beast inside Arthur, devouring his peace and his sleep. Every business meeting seemed trivial, every phone call an irritating distraction from what truly mattered. He found himself replaying conversations, dinners, holidays, searching for signs he had missed. Leo's quietness, his reluctance to go to school some mornings, the way he avoided people's eyes. They were all pieces of a puzzle that he, blinded by his dedication to work, had been unable to assemble. Now the picture was clear, and it was horrifying. He had failed, not just as a father, but as the only protector his son had in the world. His initial reaction was pragmatic and immediate: change Leo's school, hire a therapist, maybe even move out of the city. He could use his money and influence to build a new reality, a protective bubble around his son. But then he would think of the girl. The image of her, so small and so fierce, defending Leo, was the only thing that quelled the storm in his chest. She had accomplished what he, with all his resources, had not: given Leo a sense of security. He started looking for her intentionally. He would have Evans drive slowly around the school, watching the alleys and street corners. He found her on a cold afternoon. She was sitting on the steps of an abandoned public library, huddled in a corner to shield herself from the wind, completely absorbed in a thick, tattered book. The cover was torn, but he could make out the title, A Brief History of Time. He was stunned. It wasn't a children's book. It was a complex work of astrophysics that many adults would find challenging. He parked the car at a safe distance and watched her. She read with intense concentration, her lips moving slightly as she followed the words. Beside her, a stack of other discarded books formed a small tower. They were classic novels, biographies, science manuals. The street girl, whom he had assumed to be illiterate or uninterested, was a voracious reader. Intrigued, he decided to reach out. Over the next few days, he began leaving books for her, discreetly, near where she usually sat. He started with fairy tales and young adult adventures, but soon realized she devoured them in a matter of hours. He moved on to classics, children's encyclopedias, books on inventions and history. One day, he left a book on the history of Renaissance art. The next afternoon, when he picked up Leo, the girl was there in her usual spot. When Leo got into the car, he was holding a small folded piece of paper. "This is for you," he said, handing it to Arthur. He unfolded it. It was a drawing, done in charcoal on a piece of cardboard. The quality was astonishing, full of detail and shading. It was a sketch of the bronze statue in front of the school, but with a perspective and depth that showed a natural talent. "She drew it," Leo explained, with obvious pride in his voice. "She said she saw the statues in the book you left and wanted to try." Arthur looked from the drawing to his son. A new layer of prejudice he didn't even know he had began to crumble. He had seen a child in need. Now he saw an artist, an intellectual, a brilliant soul trapped in the cruelest of circumstances. He started talking to her, small conversations, initiated with a nod and a smile. He learned her name was Nina. She didn't talk much about herself, but she spoke passionately about the books she read. She could discuss the structure of a Shakespearean sonnet or the theory of relativity with surprising clarity. With each conversation, the image he had of her transformed. The poverty, the dirty clothes, the life on the streets, All of it became a backdrop to the extraordinary person she was. Her mind was a universe of knowledge gleaned from books found in the trash. The discovery was both wonderful and deeply unsettling. An intellect like that, a talent so evident, being wasted on the streets was a monumental injustice. He felt compelled to do more, to go beyond leaving books and food. But at the same time, a voice of caution whispered in his mind. Getting more involved meant crossing a line, a social boundary that people like him rarely crossed. He was Arthur Sterling. What would people think? What would the other parents at Ethelred Academy say? He had no idea that the answer to that question would come sooner and with more force than he could have ever imagined. The secret friendship between Leo and Nina continued to flourish, away from the prying eyes of the Ethelred Academy elite. For Leo, Nina was a beacon. She didn't see him as the shy, rich boy, but simply as Leo, her friend. She taught him street games with pebbles and bottle caps, things that fascinated Leo more than any next-gen video game. In return, Leo shared the stories from his illustrated books and the gourmet snacks Mrs. Gable prepared. Arthur watched this exchange with a divided heart. On one hand, his son's happiness was undeniable. Leo was more confident, more talkative, and for the first time since Helen's death, Arthur saw a genuine sparkle in his eyes. Nina's presence in his life was a balm, and Arthur's gratitude for her was immense. On the other hand, anxiety gnawed at him. He was allowing his son to become attached to a child whose life was an abyss of uncertainty. What would happen if one day Nina simply disappeared? How would he explain that to Leo? The answer to his worries came not in the form of Nina's disappearance, but in an official letter from the school. It was printed on thick, cream-colored paper, bearing the Ethelred Academy crest in gold relief. The language was polished, diplomatic, but the message was brutally clear. The school's administration had received multiple expressions of concern from other parents regarding an inappropriate presence in the vicinity of the institution. The letter mentioned the importance of maintaining a safe and suitable environment for the students and requested the cooperation of all parents to discourage interactions that might compromise the community's standards. There were no names, but Arthur knew exactly who they were referring to. The inappropriate presence was Nina. Indignation hit him like a wave. The same parents whose children were bullies, whose children had terrorized Leo for months, were now complaining about the girl who had defended him. The hypocrisy was so thick he felt he could suffocate on it. The pressure wasn't limited to the letter. The following week, while waiting for Leo, he was approached by a group of mothers, led by a woman named Beatrice Van Doren, whose son was one of Leo's main tormentors. They surrounded him with fake smiles and poisoned words. "Arthur, darling," Beatrice began, her tone condescending. "We're just concerned about safety. You know, having a street child around. We don't know where she's from, what diseases she might carry, and the influence on our children." Arthur felt his blood boil. He wanted to scream, to expose the cruelty of their sons, to defend Nina's honor, but he was a businessman. He knew an emotional outburst would only make things worse. "I appreciate your concern," he said, his voice ice cold. But my son is perfectly safe." He turned and walked away, but their words followed him, malicious whispers that questioned his judgment as a father. The hostility of this community, which he once saw as a status symbol, now felt like a gilded cage filled with prejudice and pettiness. He tried to shield Leo from it, but it was impossible. Children are reflections of their parents. At school, classmates started taunting Leo for being friends with the dirty girl. The progress he had made began to reverse. He came home quiet again, the light in his eyes dimming. Arthur found himself at a crossroads. On one side was the comfort of his social class, the approval of his peers, the easy path of simply backing away and finding another solution for Leo's loneliness. On the other was Nina, a bright, innocent girl who asked for nothing and had shown his son a kindness this elite community knew nothing of. The choice should have been simple: do the right thing. But the world he lived in was built on appearances, on maintaining the status quo. To protect Nina would mean declaring war on his own community, risking his place in the social hierarchy he had fought so hard to achieve. The social pressure, once an abstract concept, was now a tangible force, trying to crush the purest thing that had entered his son's life. He had to make a decision, and he knew that whatever it was, it would define not only the future for Leo and Nina, but the kind of man he truly was. The social pressure intensified, shifting from malicious whispers to concrete actions. One morning, arriving at the school, Arthur was met with a scene that made his stomach turn. Two uniformed academy security guards were standing on the sidewalk. Barring Nina from what had once been her informal territory, she stood across the street, small and alone, watching Leo enter through the gilded gates. The look of sadness and confusion on her face was a knife in Arthur's heart. Later that day, he received a call from the Ethelred headmaster, a pompous man named Dr. Alistair Finch. His voice was unctuous, falsely empathetic. "Arthur, we had to take a preventative measure," Finch said, "for safety reasons and, frankly, social propriety. We can't have external elements loitering on our property. I'm sure you understand." Arthur didn't understand. He understood power, influence, how money could move mountains. But here, faced with cold bureaucracy and veiled prejudice, he felt helpless. Arguing would be futile. Finch was merely executing the collective will of the parents who paid his exorbitant salary. The official ban was a devastating blow to the children's friendship. Leo was heartbroken. "Why can't I see her anymore, Dad?" he asked that night, tears in his eyes. "She didn't do anything wrong." Arthur struggled to find an explanation that wouldn't expose the ugliness of the adult world. "It's complicated, son. The school rules," he began, but the words died in his throat. They were pathetic excuses. The truth was that their society, the community he had chosen for his son, was cruel and exclusionary. The forced separation created a new challenge. Leo and Nina, however, were more resilient than the adults imagined. They began meeting in secret. Their new meeting spot was the public park, a few blocks from the school. Arthur discovered it by chance one day when he followed Leo, worried about his melancholy. He saw them sitting on an old bench under a leafy tree, sharing a bag of popcorn and laughing. The sight was so pure, so innocent, that it filled Arthur with a fierce joy and at the same time a profound fear. They were defying the system, finding a way to preserve their friendship against all odds. This new secret routine lasted little more than a week. Arthur's joy at seeing Leo's happiness restored was overshadowed by constant worry. The park was a public, open place. He couldn't guarantee their safety there the way he imagined he could at the school. He found himself torn between the desire to protect his son's happiness and the instinct to protect him from physical harm. It was during one of these afternoons of discreet surveillance that he noticed a different car parked near the park. An unmarked sedan with two serious-looking people inside. They weren't there for a stroll. They were watching the children. Arthur's blood ran cold. He approached them, his heart hammering. They were from Child Protective Services. One of the school mothers, probably Beatrice, had filed an anonymous complaint. The complaint wasn't about Nina, but about him. It questioned the suitability of a father who allowed his son, a member of the elite, to associate with an unsupervised street child. The visit from the CPS workers to his home was a humiliating experience. A man and a woman, with judgmental eyes and clipboards, asked invasive questions about his life, his routines, his ability to care for Leo. They inspected the house, Leo's room, the refrigerator. Arthur, a man accustomed to commanding boardrooms and dictating the terms of multi-million-dollar deals, was forced to defend himself, to justify his choices as a father. The threat was clear and terrifying. If they judged he was raising Leo in an unsuitable or dangerous environment, they could begin proceedings to challenge his custody. Leo and Nina's friendship was no longer just a social issue. It had become a potential legal battle. The very community he paid to protect his son was now using the system to try and take him away. The injustice of the situation was suffocating. To protect the friendship that was healing his son, he now risked losing him forever. The gilded cage was not only full of prejudice, but its bars had become terrifyingly real and threatening. The CPS investigation hung over Arthur's life like a storm cloud, poisoning every moment. He became paranoid, analyzing every word he said, every decision he made. The spontaneity in his relationship with Leo was replaced by a tense caution. He felt like he was performing on a stage, with invisible judges evaluating his every move. The fear of losing Leo was a physical pain, a constant ache in his chest that reminded him of his vulnerability. He tried to explain to Leo, as gently as possible, that they needed to be more careful, that his meetings with Nina in the park would have to stop for a while. The disappointment on Leo's face was excruciating, another wound inflicted by the cruelty of the adult world. "But why?" Leo insisted, his voice choked with emotion. "We're not doing anything wrong. She's my only friend." Arthur didn't have the courage to tell him the truth, to admit that their friendship was putting their very family at risk. "It's just for a little while, son, until things cool down," he promised, feeling like a liar. Meanwhile, Arthur used his resources to investigate Nina's situation. He hired a private investigator, a discreet and efficient man named Cole, to find out where she came from, why she was alone. He needed answers, not just out of curiosity, but because he felt a growing responsibility for her. The information Cole brought back after a few days of digging was darker than Arthur had anticipated. Nina, whose full name was Antonina Vance, was an orphan. Her parents, humble artisans, had died in a car accident 2 years ago. She had no close relatives in the city. For a brief period, she had stayed with an elderly great-aunt, but the woman passed away a few months later. Since then, Nina had been on her own, surviving on the streets. The most shocking revelation was that she didn't exist in any official records. She had never been enrolled in school, never been through a shelter, never been identified by social services. Her intelligence and survival instincts had made her invisible, an expert at avoiding the authorities who might help her by placing her in an overcrowded foster home. The discovery of Nina's complete orphanhood intensified the urgency of the situation. She wasn't just a poor child, she was a soul utterly alone in the world, navigating a dangerous existence with nothing but her own wits and courage. The thought that such a bright, resilient girl could end up swallowed by the system, lost in a group home where her potential would be stifled, was unbearable to Arthur. He felt a moral obligation to intervene, to do something more permanent than just providing books and food. But how? The CPS investigation into his own life had tied his hands. Any attempt to formally help Nina would be seen as further proof of his questionable judgment. He was trapped in a cruel paradox. To help the girl who saved his son, he first had to ensure he didn't lose his son in the process. The forced separation from Nina had a devastating effect on Leo. He regressed. The confident, talkative boy vanished, replaced by the quiet, sad child Arthur knew so well. He spent hours in his room, refusing to play or draw. School became a daily torment again. The absence of his one true friend had reopened all his emotional wounds. Desperate, Arthur allowed Leo to go to the park one afternoon, promising he would watch from a distance. They waited for hours, but Nina didn't show up. Not the next day, nor the one after. A week went by. Nina had disappeared. Panic began to set in. Arthur had Cole search for her, to scour every alley, every makeshift shelter. Leo was inconsolable. With each passing day without news, he grew more withdrawn, a small boat losing its anchor in a sea of sadness. Arthur realized, with growing terror, how deeply the two children depended on each other for their emotional stability. Nina wasn't just a friend to Leo, she was his lifeline, and now she was gone. The fear of what might have happened to her on the streets mingled with the despair of watching his son sink back into darkness, perhaps even more deeply than before. The second week without Nina began with a torrential downpour that seemed to mirror the desolation that had settled over the Sterling mansion. Leo barely ate, barely spoke. He spent most of his time at his bedroom window, staring at the wet street, as if expecting Nina to magically emerge from the storm. Arthur was at his breaking point. Cole's daily report was always the same, no sign of her. The CPS workers had scheduled another visit for the end of the week, and Leo's emotional regression would be an impossible red flag to hide. The pressure was crushing, coming from all directions. He felt like he was on a sinking ship, desperately trying to plug multiple holes at once. The guilt for having separated the children consumed him. Perhaps if he had fought harder, if he had confronted the school and the other parents from the beginning, none of this would be happening. His attempt to be cautious had resulted in the worst possible outcome. That Tuesday, Cole called with a lead. It wasn't about Nina's whereabouts, but something equally important. During his investigation into the girl's past, he had discovered something unexpected. Nina's parents, before their tragic end, had used all their savings to buy a small plot of land in a neighboring town, a quiet place where they dreamed of building a small house and a workshop for their crafts. They weren't just destitute, they had an asset, an inheritance for their daughter. And more importantly, Cole had located a rusty metal box that Nina's great-aunt had kept, containing the girl's birth certificate and the deed to the property. These were official documents, and tangible proof of her identity and her right to that land. Suddenly, Nina was no longer an anonymous girl from the streets. She was Antonina Vance, a property owner, a person with a documented history. The news was a ray of hope in the darkness. However, the hope came with a complication. Cole had also discovered that distant relatives, a cousin of Nina's parents and his wife, had recently filed a petition in court to take possession of the land. They claimed that with the parents deceased and no known heirs, the property should pass to them. They were trying to sell it quickly to a developer. Nina's situation had transformed from a tragedy of abandonment to a complex legal dispute. She had rights, but she needed someone to fight for them, someone with the resources to hire lawyers and face a court battle. Arthur felt a surge of determination. This was territory he knew. Legal battles, property disputes. This was his world. Helping Nina was no longer an act of charity. It was a matter of justice. The discovery gave Arthur a new purpose. He needed to find Nina more than ever, not just for Leo's sake, but to protect her future. That night, as Leo slept a fitful sleep, Arthur had an idea. He remembered the book on Renaissance art he had given Nina and the drawing she had made of the school statue. He remembered the abandoned public library where he had first seen her. Perhaps she wasn't looking for shelter, but for refuge. A place where she could surround herself with what she loved, knowledge and art. It was a long shot, but it was all he had. In the middle of the night, under the ceaseless rain, he drove there. The building was a dark, imposing structure. Using his phone's flashlight, he forced open a side window that seemed loose. The inside smelled of dust and old paper. He walked through the dark corridors, between shelves of forgotten books, and then, in a small reading room in the back, he saw her. She was asleep, curled up in a makeshift nest of old coats, surrounded by a barricade of books. Beside her, On the floor were dozens of drawings made on scraps of cardboard and pages torn from blank books. They were portraits of Leo, smiling. The relief that flooded Arthur was so overwhelming that his legs felt weak. He had found her, but as he knelt beside her, he noticed she was shivering, her skin hot to the touch. She had a high fever, sick and alone in the dark. The battle for justice would have to wait. First, he had to save her. Arthur acted with a speed and decisiveness he usually reserved for his most critical negotiations. He wrapped the feverish, semi-conscious Nina in his expensive coat, lifting her with a gentleness that surprised even himself. She was frighteningly light in his arms, a small bundle of bones and resilience. The drive to the nearest private hospital was a blur of wet streets and the constant swish of the windshield wipers. He took her straight to the emergency room, his commanding presence and the urgency in his voice ensuring immediate attention. As the doctors and nurses wheeled her into a treatment room, he stood in the sterile hallway, the scent of antiseptic filling his lungs, and felt a wave of panic. He was legally a stranger to her. What right did he have to authorize her treatment? What if they asked who he was? The complications of his impulsive decision began to pile up in his mind, but as he looked through the glass of the door and saw her small body on the gurney, pale and vulnerable, all worries vanished. Doing the right thing was the only option. He spent the night in an uncomfortable chair in the waiting room, refusing to go home. He called Mrs. Gable, asking her to keep an eye on Leo and tell him he had a work emergency. The lie tasted bitter on his tongue. In the morning, the doctor came to speak with him. Nina had severe pneumonia, likely the result of days of exposure to the cold and rain, compounded by malnutrition. She was on antibiotics and IV fluids, but would need several days in the hospital to recover. "Is she your daughter?" the doctor asked, a curious look in his eyes. Arthur hesitated for a second. "She is under my care," he replied, the phrase carefully chosen to be true without being a lie. Fortunately, his reputation and the promise to cover all expenses were enough to stave off further questions. When Nina finally woke up hours later, she was confused and scared. Arthur was by her bedside. "Where am I?" she whispered, her voice hoarse. "You're safe." "You're in a hospital," he said softly. "You were very sick." The fear in her eyes was replaced by suspicion. "Are you going to turn me over to them, to CPS?" The question hit him like a physical blow. He realized she hadn't disappeared by chance. She had heard the threats, sensed the danger, and had hidden herself to stay safe, even if it meant getting sick and being alone. "No," Arthur said, with a conviction that came from the depths of his soul. "I'm not going to let anyone take you. I promise I will protect you." For the first time, she seemed to relax. The trust in her eyes was a fragile, precious gift, and he swore to himself he would not break it. In the following days, the hospital room became an unlikely sanctuary. Arthur brought Leo to visit her. The reunion was emotional and quiet. Leo just held Nina's hand, his eyes full of relieved tears, while she gave him a weak smile. Leo's joy was palpable, a light returning to his face. He brought his books and read to her in a low voice. Arthur watched the two of them, and the sight of them together solidified his decision. This was no longer just about helping. He wanted more. He wanted to give Nina the family she had lost and give Leo the sister he never had. The idea of adopting her began to take shape in his mind, not as a fleeting thought, but as a concrete plan. He contacted his personal lawyer, one of the best in the city, and explained the situation. The lawyer was blunt. It would be an arduous legal battle. The distant relatives had already started proceedings for the property. CPS already viewed him with suspicion. Adopting a street child with no blood ties would be a monumental challenge against a prejudiced system. But Arthur didn't care. For the first time in his life, he was ready to fight for something money couldn't buy. The battle for Nina, for justice, and for the creation of a new family had just begun. and the stakes were higher than any deal he had ever closed. News of Nina's hospitalization and Arthur's intent to seek custody spread like wildfire through the Ethelred Academy community. Beatrice Van Doren and her circle of mothers wasted no time. The narrative they wove was poisonous. Arthur Sterling, an unstable, grieving man, had brought a diseased child of dubious origin into their circle, putting everyone at risk. The hypocrisy was glaring. The same parents whose children were bullies now positioned themselves as protectors of morality and safety. Arthur began receiving calls from school board members and other influential parents, all politely expressing their concern, but with a clear underlying message. He was upsetting the natural order of things. The pressure was immense, but something inside Arthur had shifted. The fury he once suppressed now hardened into a cold resolve. He no longer saw their prejudice as an obstacle, but as an enemy to be defeated. The first real battle took place on the legal front. Nina's distant relatives, the Martins, were notified of the existence of a direct heir to the property. Their reaction was aggressive. They hired a lawyer who immediately began painting Nina as a delinquent and Arthur as an eccentric millionaire with ulterior motives. The first preliminary hearing was a circus. The Martins' lawyer argued that Nina was a feral child, incapable of managing any assets, and that Arthur was just trying to exploit the situation for positive publicity or some unknown benefit. Arthur's lawyer, a seasoned and calm man named Mr. Davies, countered with facts: Nina's birth certificate, the deed, and the fact she was receiving top-quality medical care. But the judge seemed skeptical, swayed by the apparent social disparity between the parties. Arthur left the courthouse feeling the weight of the system against him. The most painful revelation, however, came from an unexpected source. Mr. Davies, using Cole's investigative resources, discovered a disturbing connection. Beatrice's eldest son, Leo's main tormentor, was close friends with the Martins' son. They belonged to the same country club. The information hit Arthur like a bolt of lightning. It wasn't a coincidence. Beatrice, in her crusade to remove Nina from her children's lives, had likely informed the Martins about the Thai street girl encroaching on the Ethelred circle. The bullying Leo suffered and the legal battle for Nina's inheritance were intrinsically linked. It was a conspiracy of prejudice, orchestrated by people who saw children like Leo and Nina not as human beings, but as threats to their perfectly curated world. The discovery ignited a righteous anger in Arthur. They weren't just being cruel, they were conspirators. While the legal battle unfolded, Nina's recovery progressed. As soon as she was discharged, Arthur brought her home. Mrs. Gable's reaction was one of pure kindness. The housekeeper, who had watched Leo suffer in silence for so long, welcomed Nina with open arms, treating her with the warmth of a grandmother. Seeing Nina in the guest room, dressed in clean, comfortable clothes, surrounded by new books Arthur had bought, was a moment of profound satisfaction. Her presence brought life and laughter to the house. She and Leo were inseparable, doing homework together, drawing side by side, creating a small universe of friendship that was impervious to the ugliness of the outside world. The transformation in Leo was miraculous. He was no longer the shadow of a boy. He was vibrant, happy, protective of his new sister. Arthur realized that in fighting for Nina, he was in fact fighting for his own son's soul. This realization strengthened his resolve. He wasn't just facing some petty parents and greedy relatives. He was fighting a system of social hypocrisy, and he was determined to expose the truth, no matter the cost. Life in the Sterling mansion found a new rhythm, a harmony Arthur hadn't felt since Helen was alive. Nina's presence was like the missing piece of a puzzle he didn't even know was incomplete. She had an insatiable curiosity and a wisdom that belied her age. She challenged Arthur with questions about his business, about the universe, about history, absorbing every answer like a sponge. Leo, in turn, blossomed under her influence. He became Nina's guide to the world of comfort and technology he knew, while she was his guide to a world of resilience and imagination. They spent hours in the garden, where Nina, with her practical knowledge gained on the streets, taught Leo how to identify plants and observe the habits of birds. For Arthur, watching them was a constant reminder of what was at stake. It wasn't just a matter of custody, it was the preservation of this fragile, newly formed family. Outside the walls of his home, however, the social storm intensified. The peak of the hostility came in the form of a fabricated accusation. One afternoon, Arthur received a call from the local police department. An expensive watch belonging to a student at Ethelred Academy, Beatrice's son, had gone missing, and an anonymous witness had conveniently claimed to have seen Nina lurking around the lockers the day she had visited the school with Arthur weeks before. The accusation was absurd and clearly a setup, but it was dangerous. Suddenly, Nina was no longer just an inappropriate presence. She was being painted as a thief, a juvenile delinquent. The news spread quickly, further poisoning public opinion against them. It was a low blow, designed to criminalize an innocent child and destroy any chance Arthur had in the courts. Arthur felt a kind of rage that frightened him. It was cold, calculated, and utterly ruthless. They had crossed a line. Attacking him was one thing. Attacking a defenseless child was something else entirely. He put his entire legal and investigative machine into motion. While Mr. Davies prepared the defense against the theft charge, Cole was tasked with finding the truth. Arthur knew Beatrice was behind this, but he needed proof. The situation tested his willingness to risk everything. Defending Nina publicly against a theft charge, even a false one, would tarnish his own reputation. In the world of business, image was everything. Associating his name with a criminal scandal could have serious repercussions. His partners advised him to back away, to let social services handle Nina. "It's not worth it, Arthur," one of them said. "You're risking your empire for a child you found on the street." But Arthur barely heard him. The empire he had built seemed empty and meaningless compared to the injustice he was witnessing. That night, he found Nina sitting in the library, staring at the rain beating against the window. She was quiet, the weight of the accusation visible in her small, hunched frame. "They think I'm a thief," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "That's what they always think." Her words, filled with a painful resignation, were the final straw. Arthur sat down beside her. "I don't," he said, his voice firm. "And Leo doesn't. And Mrs. Gable doesn't, and we are your family. And family protects each other." He looked into her eyes, making a silent promise. He wouldn't just defend her, he would go on the offensive. He would use every resource, every ounce of his influence, not only to prove her innocence, but to expose the rot and hypocrisy of those who persecuted her. The battle was no longer just about custody or an inheritance. It had become a war for the truth, and Arthur Sterling was, for the first time in a long time, fighting for something he truly believed in. The theft accusation, though fabricated, had its intended effect. It fast-tracked the intervention from Child Protective Services. They scheduled an emergency hearing, citing the criminal complaint as proof of the unstable environment Arthur was providing. The hearing would determine not only Nina's immediate future, whether she would be placed in a state-run shelter, but would also reassess Arthur's custody of Leo. The threat of losing both children was now imminent and terrifyingly real. Arthur's world felt like it was crumbling, attacked on all sides by a system that seemed designed to punish kindness and reward prejudice. The pressure was so intense he barely slept, spending his nights in his office, strategizing with Mr. Davies and getting updates from Cole. Meanwhile, Cole was working tirelessly behind the scenes. He knew a defense based on simple denials wouldn't be enough. They needed irrefutable proof of Nina's innocence and, ideally, of her accuser's guilt. The investigation led him down an unexpected path. He started analyzing the street-facing security cameras from Ethelred Academy, looking for anything out of the ordinary on the day of the alleged theft. After days of reviewing hours of low-quality footage, he found it, a tiny detail, almost unnoticeable. The footage showed Beatrice's son leaving the school, and for a split second, as he got into his mother's car, something shiny fell from his pocket. He didn't seem to notice. Minutes later, another camera from a corner store captured an image of Beatrice picking something up from the ground near where her car had been parked before driving off. It was circumstantial, but it was a start. The real breakthrough came from a human source. Cole, with his knack for blending in and listening, discovered that one of the school's groundskeepers had been abruptly fired the previous week. The man was bitter and willing to talk. He told Cole that he had found the missing watch near a flower bed on the same day it disappeared. He had returned it to Beatrice, who was on campus for a parent council meeting. She had thanked him, given him a generous tip, and said she would take care of it. The next day, the groundskeeper was fired for a trivial reason. He realized he had been silenced. Beatrice not only knew the watch hadn't been stolen, she had it in her possession the entire time. The accusation against Nina was a deliberate, cruel lie, orchestrated to remove her from the picture. With the groundskeeper's signed affidavit, Arthur finally had the weapon he needed. The discovery of the truth, however, didn't lessen the tension leading up to the hearing. It was a double-edged sword. They could expose Beatrice's lie, but it would mean an open, public war against one of the city's most influential families. It would be the word of a fired groundskeeper against that of a respected socialite. The night before the hearing was the longest of Arthur's life. He found Leo awake, sitting on the edge of his bed, his face pale with worry. "Dad, are they going to take Nina away?" he asked, his voice trembling. "What if they take me away too?" Arthur sat beside him and hugged him tightly. "And I'm not going to let that happen," he said, his voice filled with a conviction he struggled to feel. "Tomorrow, we're going to tell the truth. And the truth is the strongest thing there is. But it's going to take courage, especially from you." He explained to Leo that the judge might want to hear his story, that he would need to talk about the bullying, about how Nina helped him, about what her friendship meant to him. He saw the fear in his son's eyes, the fear of facing his tormentors and their parents in such an intimidating setting. Tomorrow's battle wouldn't just be fought by lawyers. Their future depended on the courage of a 9-year-old boy to finally find his voice. The courtroom was cold and impersonal, a space where emotions were contained by dark wood paneling and the formality of legal proceedings. Arthur sat at the table with Mr. Davies, Nina on one side and Leo on the other. Nina was dressed in a simple dress Mrs. Gable had bought for her, looking even smaller and more fragile in the oversized chair. Leo gripped his father's hand tightly, his knuckles white. Across the room were the Martins with their lawyer, and, in a show of community support, Beatrice and several other Ethelred parents sat in the back pews, their faces masks of false concern. The CPS workers sat at a separate table, their notebooks open, ready to record every word. The judge, a middle-aged woman with a stern expression, entered, and the air in the room seemed to grow even thinner. The hearing began, and the Martins, lawyer, and the CPS representative painted a bleak, distorted picture. They spoke of Nina as a dangerous influence, an uncontrolled child. They spoke of Arthur as an irresponsible father, his judgment clouded by grief. They presented the theft accusation as the final proof of the situation's unsuitability. Arthur listened, the blood pounding in his ears, forcing himself to remain calm, to trust Mr. Davies' plan. When it was their turn, Mr. Davies was methodical. He presented Nina's birth certificate, the deed, establishing her identity and her rights. Then he called his surprise witness, the groundskeeper. The man, though nervous, told his story clearly and concisely, describing how he found the watch and returned it to Beatrice. A murmur rippled through the room. Beatrice turned pale but maintained her composure. Her lawyer stood, discrediting the testimony as the vengeful words of a disgruntled employee. The judge seemed impassive, her expression unreadable. The case was balanced on a knife's edge. It was then that Mr. Davies made his riskiest move. "Your Honor, I would like to call my final witness to the stand, Leo Sterling." A shocked silence fell over the court. Leo tensed. Arthur squeezed his hand. "It's okay, son. Just tell the truth." On trembling legs, Leo walked to the witness stand. He looked like a small island in a vast ocean. The judge watched him with a slightly softer gaze. "Do you know why you're here, Leo?" she asked gently. Leo nodded, swallowing hard. "Yes, to talk about my friend Nina." Mr. Davies guided him with simple questions. Leo began to speak, his voice low and hesitant at first. He talked about feeling lonely at school, about the boys who pushed him and called him names. He didn't look at them, but everyone in the room knew who he was talking about. Then he spoke of the day Nina defended him. "She was brave," Leo said, his voice gaining strength. "No one had ever stood up for me before, not even my dad knew." He shot a quick glance at Arthur, a look not of accusation but of simple fact. Arthur felt the sting of those words like a needle to his heart. "She made me feel safe," Leo continued. "She taught me it's okay to be different. She's the smartest and kindest person I know. She's not a thief. She's my best friend. She's my sister." The last words echoed in the silent room. Tears were streaming down Leo's face, but he didn't wipe them away. He sat up straight, his vulnerability transforming into an unshakable strength. He looked directly at Beatrice, and for the first time, there was no fear in his eyes. There was only the truth. The purity and honesty of his testimony were more powerful than any legal argument. In that moment, on that stand, the shy boy who was afraid of his own shadow had become a lion, defending his family. The fate of everyone in the room now rested on the impact of those words on the heart of a single judge. Leo's testimony hung in the air, a truth so pure and resonant that no legal objection could diminish it. The judge watched the boy for a long moment, her previously stern face now softened by an emotion she tried to contain. She looked at Beatrice, whose face was blotched with anger and humiliation, and then at Arthur, who was gazing at his son with overwhelming pride. The silence was broken by the judge's calm but firm voice. "Beatrice Van Doren," she said, the name cutting through the air. "Based on the testimony I have heard today, I'm issuing a court order for you to surrender the watch in question to this court immediately. I am also referring this matter to the District Attorney's Office for investigation of perjury and obstruction of justice." A gasp of shock escaped Beatrice's lips. The mask of social superiority finally crumbled, revealing the ugliness beneath. The judge banged her gavel. "As for the primary matter," she continued, looking directly at Arthur, "the charge against the minor, Antonina Vance, is dismissed for lack of evidence." A collective sigh of relief came from Arthur's table. She then turned to the issue of custody. This court recognizes Antonina Vance as the sole legal heir to the property of her late parents. The Martins' claim to the property is therefore null and void. The Martins stared at the floor, defeated. "Regarding temporary guardianship," the judge went on, "and the investigation into Mr. Sterling's fitness as a parent, this court has today seen a remarkable testament to fatherhood. It has seen a father who, despite his admitted failings, is clearly willing to cross worlds to protect not only his own child, but a child in need. And it has seen a boy who, because of the loving and supportive environment his father is striving to create, found the courage to speak truth to power." She paused, her eyes meeting Arthur's. "The CPS investigation is closed. I am granting Mr. Arthur Sterling temporary custody of Antonina Vance, with the recommendation that he begin formal adoption proceedings as soon as possible." The words washed over Arthur like a wave of warmth and relief. It was over. They had won. Leo rushed back to the table and hugged Nina tightly, both of them crying, this time with joy. Arthur stood and reached out a hand to Mr. Davies, but the lawyer just smiled and nodded toward the children. The real victory was right there. Outside the courthouse, the reality of the win began to set in. Beatrice and her circle hurried past them, avoiding eye contact. Their social empire had suffered an irreparable crack. Arthur felt no triumph, only a weary sadness for the pettiness that had caused so much pain. As he guided the children to the car, he stopped. "Leo," he said, kneeling to meet his son's gaze, "I am so proud of you. What you did in there was the bravest thing I've ever seen." Leo smiled, a genuine, radiant smile. "I just told the truth, Dad, like you said." Arthur then turned to Nina. "Welcome to the family, officially," he said, his voice thick with emotion. She said nothing, but her eyes, shining with unshed tears, said everything. In that moment, under the city's grey sky, the three of them embraced. They were no longer a rich man and two children from different worlds. They were a family, forged in the fire of adversity, bound by a love that had proven stronger than prejudice, lies, and injustice. The journey had been painful, but the resolution of their primary conflicts was not just a legal victory. It was a profound and transformative emotional healing for them all. 7 weeks. Only 7 weeks had passed since that rainy afternoon at the gates of Ethelred Academy, but to Arthur, it felt like a lifetime. The mansion, once a silent mausoleum to his grief and absence, now echoed with the sounds of laughter and lively conversation. The most significant transformation, however, was not in the house's atmosphere, but within himself. The father who had used money as a substitute for presence had learned the most valuable lesson of his life. True protection came not from high walls or bank accounts, but from the courage to connect, to be present, to fight for what is right. He discovered that fatherhood wasn't about building an empire for his son, but about building a safe harbor in his son's heart. He kept his promise. Nina's adoption process was underway, and though the bureaucracy was slow, the outcome was certain. Legally, she would soon be Antonina Vance Sterling, but in their hearts, she already was. Her parents' small property was secured, and Arthur, together with Nina, began to draft plans for the land's future. They wouldn't sell it. Instead, they dreamed of one day building a small community center there, a place of learning and art for other children who, like Nina, had so much to offer but so few opportunities. He also made another major decision. He pulled Leo from Ethelred Academy. The courtroom victory was a vindication, but the school's atmosphere was irredeemably poisoned by prejudice. He enrolled them both in a smaller, more inclusive school known for celebrating social diversity and focusing on students' emotional well-being as much as their academics. It was a world away from the exclusionary elite of Ethelred. The final scene unfolds on a sunny Saturday, months later. The new family isn't on a luxury yacht or at a 5-star resort. They are in the mansion's backyard, which has been transformed. A portion of it is now a community garden. A project Arthur started with a local foundation to provide fresh vegetables for shelters. Leo and Nina are on their knees in the dirt, teaching a group of children from a nearby shelter how to plant tomato seeds. Nina, the girl once rejected by society, is now the teacher, sharing her knowledge with a quiet, radiant confidence. She wears her past not as a wound, but as a source of strength and empathy. Arthur watches from a short distance, his shirt sleeves rolled up, his hands stained with soil. He isn't on the phone closing a deal. He is just there, present, watching his children flourish. He remembers the gilded gates of Ethelred, which once symbolized security and status, but in reality represented exclusion and fear. Now, the gates of his own home were open, welcoming children from all walks of life, proving that opportunity can and should be equal for all. he learned that life's greatest teachers are often those whom society values least. Nina, with nothing but her courage and a mind hungry for knowledge, hadn't just saved his son from bullies, she had saved him from himself, teaching him that true success isn't measured by the status one accumulates, but by the ability to create a world where every child feels safe, valued, and loved, regardless of their origin. Leo runs up to him, holding a small sprout in his hands. "Dad, look, it's growing." Arthur smiles, putting an arm around his son's shoulder. He looks over at Nina, who is laughing with the other children, and he knows, with a certainty that warms his soul, that yes, it is. Everything is.